What this video is going to do is this will help us wrap up our meanwhile around the world as we lead up to World War II. We were working on this last week before, we were exiled to our various homes to sit on the couch for weeks on end and go slowly crazy. So, let's get started. We left off talking a bit about Russia. We'd mentioned that Stalin had purged his enemies, anybody that he didn't like. He had moved them to various places all around the Soviet Union, which was absolutely massive, with the intent of making sure that nobody had a power base to challenge him. At the same time, if people did challenge him, like the Ukrainians, for example, he basically cut off the country and starved them. Millions of Ukrainians died in the mid-1930s. Is the result of Stalin basically starving them into submission. It's a horrible event in world history that never really gets remarked upon because it falls in the midst of the Great Depression for us, and it is a kind of little speed bump, unfortunately, on the road to World War II, and people tend to gloss over it. As we said last week, Stalin made a pact with Adolf Hitler called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named after the two foreign ministers from those countries. They basically said, hey, we're not going to go to war with each other. In fact, Germany, if you want to invade Poland, we'll let you do that as long as you only take the western half of it and leave the eastern half to Russia. In return, both countries would get essentially a buffer zone between the two of them and, not have to touch each other. Fascists and Nazis are about as far left and fascists are Nazis, are about as far right as you can get on the political spectrum, and communists, at least on paper, are about as far left as you can get. So they despise each other, which is why the world was sort of taken aback when these two big dictators in Europe decided to not just go at it hammer and tongs with each other. Stalin's going to spend most of the 1930s isolating Russia from the rest of the world and attempting to make communism happen. It's not going to work particularly well, and Stalin is going to become what we would call an autocrat, or is the one person running the country. In the meantime, another big important thing that's going to happen here is the Nazis are going to essentially trick Joseph Stalin into believing that most of the good Russian generals are in fact Nazi spies. Stalin's going to take this hook, line, and sinker, and he's going to end up executing or at least imprisoning most of his best generals. One of the best generals that the Russians are going to have during World War II is going to get pulled out of a prison camp, and he's going to have mostly metal teeth because in the midst of torturing him for information that he did not have, the Russians are going to pull most of his teeth out. So those are the good guys with the Russians as far as World War II is going to go. Now, on the other side of Asia from all of these folks are the Japanese. They've been seen as the new power in the Pacific for the last almost 40 years at this point. If we recall back to Teddy Roosevelt, we remember he negotiated a peace treaty in the Russo-Japanese War between the Russians and the Japanese, where the Japanese absolutely spanked the Russian Navy and basically, as a result, were able to become the power in the Pacific. They were not up to the level of the German, the British, or the American Navy at the time, but they were very, very good. So the Japanese see this as kind of their destiny, that they are to become the power in the Eastern Hemisphere. And they're going to start developing what they're going to call the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, which basically means they're going to take over anything and everything they can that touches the Pacific Ocean. For years, 19-teens, 1920s, part of the 1930s, most of the 1930s, they're going to work with the U.S. government. We are going to train their naval officers. We will help train their military officers. We will show them how to do stuff because we think that Japan is going to become a powerful country, and, we want to get in on that. The problem Japan has is threefold. One, they don't have raw materials. They need to import all of their metal, or the vast majority of their metal. Two, they need to import almost all of their fuel oil. They don't have a lot. Japanese islands are rather rocky and pretty forested. There's not a lot there to work with. Thirdly, and you don't see this on here, but I'd like you to include this in your notes, Japan has a very strict set of cultural guidelines that ascribes to a warrior philosophy called Bushido, Bushido. And that basically means that the warriors are going to take the top spot in the society. They have a very strict code of ethics. They will never surrender. They will fight to the death. A very strong concept of honor, but not as we would think of it as Westerners, a very Japanese sense of honor, which, as you will see in the next chapter, is going to cause some massive problems. So, with those weaknesses, Japan, as they grow their military, is going to become very reliant, especially on the U.S., for those supplies that they can't get on their own. In the 1930s, they're going to invade Manchuria, which is the northern part of China, sort of where China meets what is now Russia and North Korea. And they're going to take that over and recall it Manchukuo. They're going to invade further down into China. They will have a war crime happen there that goes on for weeks called the Rape of Nanking, which is basically every horrible thing you can imagine happening is going to happen to Japanese, or is going to be done by the Japanese to Chinese citizens in Nanking, which is a major city in northern China. The Japanese still deny this to this day, despite the fact that there were a number of observers from countries all over the world, U.S., German, Austrian, basically any country in Europe, some countries in South America, us. We all see this happen, documented, and it's horrible. But Japan is going to spend the rest of the 1930s, so basically 1936, 37 onward, in trying to take over China. And the Chinese military, which is backed by the United States, is not very good at what they do. They're incredibly corrupt, and they don't actually like to fight. So Japan is going to take control of China. The Japanese military is basically going to take control of the country at this point and expand. For right now, the rest of the world's going to look and be like, hey, it's not our problem. We got stuff we got to deal with in Europe. And the U.S. is going to look at it and be like, hey, we are making bank right now selling all this fuel and raw materials to the Japanese. So we're cool with it. We're a little iffy on some of it, but for the most part, we're pretty cool with it. Now, back to this fella. This is Neville Chamberlain. He is the Prime Minister of the UK in the 1930s. He does not want another World War I. So he's going to do what is called appeasement, to appease Adolf Hitler. That's what this sheet of paper is right here. It's meaningless. So let's talk about appeasement. Neville Chamberlain is going to have a meeting with Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler is going to come up to him and say, hey, I'm going to just cut off part of Czechoslovakia. The western part of it, those people speak German. They have a German background. Remember when we talked about Hitler liking his blonde, blue-eyed Aryans? He believed that the people in western Czechoslovakia were those sort of people. Therefore, they should be part of Germany, not part of Czechoslovakia. Did it matter that they did not particularly want to be taken over? No, it did not. So he says, we're going to take this over. Deal with it. And that's essentially what's going to happen. Neville Chamberlain and a number of other representatives from European countries are going to meet up with Hitler, and they're going to say, all right, here's the deal. If you don't ask for anything else, we'll let you have that chunk of Czechoslovakia. Neville Chamberlain comes back and says, peace in our time. I have avoided World War II. We have solved this problem. I am the greatest. Look at me. People applaud him. This is right after he gets off the plane back from Munich, Germany. Here's the problem. Adolf Hitler is the mouse, and if you give a mouse a cookie. And what Neville Chamberlain just did is he just gave Hitler a cookie. Over the next couple of months, Hitler will take over the rest of Czechoslovakia, and over the next couple of years, he will continue to expand, looking for what he calls Lebensraum, or living space for the German people. Hitler has now seen that Europe is so terrified of getting into another world war that he can continue to just basically take anything he wants, and nobody's going to stop him. And that's where we're going to leave it off with Europe for right now, is Italy is playing second fiddle to Germany. Germany is expanding ever outward, taking up more and more territory. Joseph Stalin is in the midst of reorganizing his country in the most violent way possible. And in Japan, the military is essentially taken over. in all but name. They answer to the emperor, but their number one goal is to control the entirety of the Pacific Ocean, which, as we will see later on, and as you probably already know, is going to be a bit of a problem. What with the U.S. controlling a bunch of coaling stations we got from the Spanish all throughout the Pacific, and that little thing called Hawaii. Now, last thing we need to touch on before I wrap up today is the good neighbor policy. Franklin Roosevelt, in an attempt to cut down on costs and help us get along better with our Central American neighbors, is going to implement what he calls the good neighbor policy. So Franklin Roosevelt is going to pull U.S. troops out of a number of Central and South American countries, and he's going to just say, hey, we're not going to tell you what to do so much anymore. We're just going to sort of nudge it in the right direction and hope that works. And by doing this, Roosevelt is hoping that any distaste towards America is sort of going to dry up and go away if we're not there as much. So, hey, we're just here to help you. The Monroe Doctrine is there if you need it. The Roosevelt Corollary is there if you need it. But we're not going to be as pushy as we used to be as your American neighbors. And we hope that works. All right, our next slide, or our next set of slides, I'll do another video on that, and that will close up this chapter. So remember, if you have questions, leave them in notes on the YouTube video, and we'll go from there. Stay healthy, stay safe. Talk to you guys soon. Bye.